Hello, we welcome you to this Bible study, which is the last Bible study session on our Heart of David series. We will conclude the series with a look at Solomon's reign. Towards the end of his reign, he did things that caused him to lose favor with God. We will look carefully at what Solomon did wrong and try to learn from his experience. We will learn that Solomon was a very gifted person. He had extraordinary wisdom and wealth. He worshipped God with great reverence. He built one of the things that showed his love of God and his closeness was the temple he built in Jerusalem and the palace that he built. And he dedicated the temple, and God accepted it by visiting with him and renewing his covenant with David. But Solomon also married 700 wives and 300 concubines. And several of the wives, a large number of the wives came from foreign countries that God had warned the Israelites to stay away from because they worship man-made gods, and staying away from them will be a way to ensure they don't tempt you to go towards their type of worship. But Solomon married from these people, married from the royal families, and eventually the wives led him astray and away from God. He broke God's covenant because God had an important aspect of the covenant is that they have to worship him. That God had a covenant with David in which he said that if your children, if your descendants live and observe my decrees and my commandments and do not worship another God, then you will always have somebody on the throne of Israel. Solomon broke this because he worshipped another God. He worshipped other gods, in fact, with his foreign wives. God was displeased, and he came and spoke to Solomon and said, okay, he will tear off the kingdom, but because of David, he was going to wait for Solomon to conclude his reign, and after that, he will tear the kingdom from Solomon's son and give it to other people. Everything we study today is from 1 Kings chapter 11. But in order to set the background, we will get information from earlier chapters of 1 Kings. We will begin with Solomon's wisdom. Solomon was gifted with wisdom and great insight. His wisdom was so much that people came from different countries just to listen to him talk, listen to his sayings. We know about the book of Proverbs. There are about 3,000 proverbs that he came up with, and he composed and wrote 1,005 songs. He was a great scholar. He studied plants, animals, birds, reptiles, fish, different living things. And people from all nations came to hear him. Let us read about this description of Solomon's wisdom in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 to 34. The word of God in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 29. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the men of the East, and greater than all the wisdom of Egypt. He was wiser than any other man, including Ethan the Ezrahite, wiser than Heman, Calcol, and Dada, the sons of Mahol. And his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs numbered 1,005. He described plant life, from the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of walls. He also taught about animals and birds, reptiles and fish. Men of all nations came to listen to Solomon's wisdom, sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. So Solomon had people coming from all over the world to listen to him. A famous visitor, or famous among these visitors, is the Queen of Sheba. The Queen of Sheba visited Solomon mainly because she heard about his wisdom and his wealth and the things he built, the temple he built and the palace he built. So the Queen of Sheba came to see these things, but also to ask him some hard questions to test his wisdom. Well, Solomon answered all her questions with ease. None of them was difficult for him. He, in fact, exceeded her expectations. And the queen remarked that, when she was told about Solomon's wisdom, that she didn't really believe it, but she had found that the wisdom was, in fact, more than they had told her. And she testified to the great relationship between God and Israel, saying that God made Solomon king of Israel because God loved Israel. In other words, that making Solomon king of Israel was a credit, was something good for Israel because of his wisdom. Let us read about this in 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relation to the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the sitting of his officials, the attending servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, nothing even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your men must be! How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." So the Queen of Sheba heaped all these praises on Solomon. Solomon had an encounter, his first encounter with God at Gibeon when he went to offer sacrifice. We bring this in this lesson to show that Solomon worshipped God with great reverence and he had a very good relationship with God. God appeared to him at Gibeon in a dream and then asked him or told him to ask for anything he wanted. He could ask for whatever he wanted. First, he worshipped God, telling God that God was kind to his father David because David was righteous and upright in heart. Then he said that all he wanted was to be a good king for the people of Israel. So he asked God to give him a discerning heart so that he can distinguish between right and wrong. In other words, so that he will be able to administer justice, fair justice to the people of Israel. He believed that the people of Israel needed a great king because they were a great people. And that the only way he could become the type of great king that they needed was for God to grant him wisdom so that he will be able to distinguish between what is right and what is wrong. Let us read about this in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 2 to 10. The people, however, were still sacrificing at the high places because a temple had not yet been built for the name of the Lord. Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of his father David, except that he offered sacrifices and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to offer sacrifices, for that was the most important high place. And Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream. And God said, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." Solomon answered, "You have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. You have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on his throne this very day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So Solomon asked for, the only thing he asked for him when he was given opportunity to ask for whatever he wanted was wisdom, the ability to govern and administer justice fairly. That's all he wanted. And God was pleased that he asked for this. Then Solomon built a temple. David had wanted to build this temple, but God told him and said, "Look, your son, your offspring will build a temple for me." So the temple was, in fact, God's promise. And by Solomon building it, Solomon fulfilled God's promise to David. Then after the temple was built, a magnificent temple that people from all over the world came to see, he dedicated the temple in a ceremony in front of all the Israelites. And he dedicated the temple with worship and prayer, showing his closeness to God and his strong belief in God. And he used the opportunity of the dedication to renew his commitment to God. Let us read about the dedication in 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 22 to 30. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven. and said, O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. Now, Lord God of Israel, keep for your servant David, my father, the promises you made to him when you said, you shall never fail to have a man to sit before me on the throne of Israel, if only your sons are careful in all they do to walk before me as you have done. And now, O God of Israel, let your word that you promised your servant David, my father, come true. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built? Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, O Lord my God. Hear the cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place of which you have said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer your servant prays toward this place. Hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. That's only an excerpt from the great prayer that Solomon prayed to dedicate the temple. It's really worth reading. Then after the dedication, God appeared to Solomon just like he had appeared to him in Gibeon. And God reaffirmed his covenant with David. And the covenant is that David will forever have a person on the throne of Israel, on one condition, that his descendants will worship him forever. And he used this opportunity to tell Solomon about the consequences of breaking the covenant. At the dedication of the temple, based on what God told Solomon, it looks like God already knew that Solomon was going to break the covenant. So he reminded him of the consequences of breaking the covenant. Let us read about this in 1 Kings chapter 9, verses 1 to 9. When Solomon had finished building the temple of the Lord and the royal palace, and had achieved all he had desired to do, the Lord appeared to him a second time, as he had appeared to him at Gibeon. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you have made before me. I have consecrated this temple, which you have built, by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, if you walk before me in integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever, as I promised David your father when I said, you shall never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. But if you or your sons turn away from me and do not observe the commands and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I'll cut off Israel from the land I have given them, and will reject this temple I have consecrated for my name. Israel will then become a byword and an object of ridicule among all peoples. And though this temple is now imposing, all who pass by will be appalled and will scoff and say, "Why has the Lord done such a thing to this land and to this temple?" People will answer, "Because they have forsaken the Lord their God, who brought their fathers out of Egypt, and have embraced other gods, worshipping and serving them. That is why the Lord brought all this disaster on them." So God knew that Solomon was going to break the covenant. So he used the occasion of the dedication of the temple to, in fact, warn Solomon and say, "Look, I will keep the promise that I made to your father if you satisfy the condition that you will always worship me and will not worship other gods. But if you forsake me and begin to worship other gods, then I will abandon, not only abandon you, I will abandon Israel, take the land I gave them, and make this temple a place of ridicule." So Solomon was warned, but he did go astray. He married 700 wives from different royal families. He had 300 concubines. I mean, these are staggering numbers when it comes to relationship between a man and women. But they were real. 700 wives from royal families and 300 concubines. He married from countries that God had prohibited Israel from intermarrying. He said, "Look, don't intermarry with people from this country because they worship man-made gods." And he loved his wives. Because he loved them, he slowly joined them to worship their gods. And this is how he went astray from God. Let us read about this in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 8. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 1. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord has told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. He followed Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He did not follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. On a hill east of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. He did the same for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. So Solomon departed from God. He worshipped other gods, and since he had 700 wives and he was doing this with his wives, so he worshipped several other gods. his mind went away from the God that he had promised to worship. There is no doubt to say that God was displeased. God didn't like it at all. He came to Solomon and said, well, since this is what you have done, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you, but I will not do it during your time. Because of your father David, I'll leave you to complete your reign. Then I'll tear the kingdom in two. I'll leave one for your son, one part of the kingdom, because of my promise to David and because of my love for Jerusalem. For the sake of David and for the sake of Jerusalem, I'll leave one half for your son, but the other half will be given to other people. Let us read about this in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 9 to 13. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates. Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So, God announced his punishment to Solomon. Solomon had departed from God. But remember, we started this Bible study session by describing how close Solomon was to God, how he worshipped God with reverence. How when God gave him an opportunity to ask for something, the only thing he asked for was to be a good king to God's people, the people of Israel. So he was a great man of God. He really worshipped God. He believed in God. Then what happened? Why is it that as he matured, and after God had given him so much wisdom, so much wealth, after he had accomplished so much, he built this great temple, magnificent temple, he built this palace. And at the dedication, the prayer he prayed is one exemplary prayer that is worth reading. He wrote so many proverbs. The book of the Proverbs was written by Solomon. The Song of Songs, he had so many songs that he composed. So he was a great worshiper. He worshipped God, he loved God, he was close to God. Then why did he depart from God? What made him lose focus? Well, what we think, because the Bible didn't really explain, but the information is there. He married 700 wives from royal families. It looked like he wanted to accomplish something exemplary. Because of his extraordinary wisdom and extraordinary wealth, he began to see himself above everybody, above his environment, above his time. And he wanted to accomplish something even more extraordinary. And what he identified was marrying from every royal family that he could find. He married 700 wives of royal birth. So that is 700 different royal families. And each of these from countries that worship different things. So the 700 wives and 300 concubines, each of them will have his own social and religious agenda they have their gods they worship, and maybe part of their demand when he married them was, hey, I'm coming with my, their idols and whatever they worship, that they were coming with their worship. And he had so many, 1,000 of them. If you count only his wives, then he had 700 of them. So he was driven to this, I think, because he wanted to accomplish, he wanted an extraordinary accomplishment that is even more extraordinary than his wealth and wisdom and all the other accomplishments like the temple and the palace that he built. As we said earlier, he started with a strong belief in God, and he probably believed that he was so close to God and so strong in his relationship with God that he didn't think anything can touch his closeness to God. He thought that his relationship with God was invincible, cannot be affected by anything in any negative way. So when he was marrying these women, he gave in to their demand and said, okay, you can bring whatever you have, but I worship my own God and close to my God, and nothing you can do can take me away from my God. So he had a strong belief. He probably succumbed slowly. When you have 700 wives making demands on you, there is 700 chances that you will succumb, maybe more than that. So he probably succumbed slowly. He didn't depart from God in one fell swoop. It was probably slowly in increments. Maybe first he succumbed to one woman and said, okay, you can go over there and worship your God. And then the other woman will see that this woman has got her own little temple, and he said that woman will make her own demand, and Solomon will say, okay, yeah, you can go over there and build a little something for your worship. And then after that, of course, once they built this, there will be, when are you going to go there with me? One of these days, you should go and see what I'm doing. They'll be tempting him in so many ways, trying to get his attention, trying to get him to pay attention to what they were doing in those places of worship that he built for them. So slowly, he began to worship with them, without knowing, without being conscious of the fact that he was slowly turning away from God. I believe it was a gradual process. He started sliding downhill, and there was nothing to stop him. And he believed so strongly in himself that he probably thought, these things, I can join them, but that does not affect my relationship with God. I'll still worship my God the way I used to. So slowly, he slid downhill and turned away from God. Well, it's not our duty here to pass judgment on Solomon. We don't really know what happened. The Bible tells us the outcome, and we know what the outcome was. He turned away, he worshipped other gods with his 700 wives and 300 concubines. And God was displeased with him and punished him for that. So that is fine. The question is, how can we learn from his experience so that we do not repeat something like that? And it's not about marrying 700 wives. Probably that's not the type of temptation that faces any of us. But we have similar temptations. Whenever you have an extraordinary capability, it could be an extraordinary wealth, it could be extraordinary knowledge, you know a lot of things and people come to you to listen to you. It may be extraordinary eloquence. When you preach, the whole world will stop and listen. Or when you are teaching, everybody wants to hear what you are teaching because you have great knowledge and you're a great teacher. Or when you pray, or people feel the presence of God right there. They want to come and join you. Or you have other qualities that draw admiration to you. These are the kind of things that can tempt you to turn away from God slowly without knowing it. With this type of extraordinary capability, you find yourself feeling superior to everybody around you, feeling that you are greater than anything, you are better than anything, you can do almost anything. You believe in God, so your belief in God cannot be touched. You are this great person that everybody admires, and you see yourself as almost infallible. Those are danger signs. When you see extraordinary wealth, extraordinary competence, extraordinary wisdom, extraordinary knowledge, something that makes people relate to you that you are a God. Something that makes people almost worship you. Yes, they are coming to you to worship God, but they are beginning to worship you because of your greatness, or you are beginning to feel that, yes, you are above all these people that are coming to you. Then when you feel that way, when you feel that you are so good, you are so strong, that is when you need to go back to the basics to avoid what happened to Solomon. You need to go back to basics. And what are the basics? The basics are quite simple. God created us in His image. He created human beings in His image and gave us power, the authority to do almost anything we want. With the authority that we are given, that God announced in Genesis 1 verse 28, He said, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and so on. That gives us an authority that exceeds every authority, except of course the authority of God. He gave us the authority to do whatever we wanted, but with one condition. Because He created us in His image to represent Him in our interactions with people and our interactions with other inhabitants of the earth. And He gave us the authority to represent Him in any way that we feel. But whatever we do must convey His image, because we are representing Him. Whatever we do must convey His image to those that could be affected or those that will observe. If what you do, if what you are attempting to do will convey the image of God, then you have the authority to do it, because the authority that God gave us is unlimited. But if what you're trying to do does not convey the image of God, then you don't have the authority to do it. Because we were created in His image to represent Him. It's very simple to say, but it covers everything. You have the authority to do anything you want, provided that what you want to do conveys the image of God to those that will be affected or those that will observe. So what that says then, the way you go back to basics is whenever you contemplate an action, whenever you are planning to do something, part of your planning will be to evaluate this and determine if it will convey, if that action will convey the image of God to those that will be affected or those that will observe. If you are unable to convince yourself that this contemplated action will convey the image of God, then stop. Don't proceed with the action. It doesn't matter what it is, because you don't have the authority to do it. If you convince yourself that the contemplated action will convey the image of God, and you know how it conveys the image of God, then you need to review your evaluation of this contemplated action several times to see if your evaluation, your conclusion that it will convey the image of God is in fact correct. How does it convey the image of God? Think through it several times. Run it through somebody, a trusted colleague. It's actually an evaluation that is quite practical for everything. An example is when David confronted Goliath. Of course, he did that evaluation in his mind, but just before he confronted Goliath, he said this battle cry that was also a prayer. He said, I'm going to cut off your head, I'm going to strike you down and cut off your head, so that the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel, that the people of Israel worship a God that protects them. So there he has shown that that action he was about to take will convey the image of God to the whole world. So every action that you contemplate can be evaluated the same way. How does it convey? How will it convey the image of God? If you cannot convince yourself, don't proceed. You don't have the authority to do it, and you probably will be led astray if you start on that path. If Solomon had done this, maybe his kingdom would have ended differently, but we don't know. And we don't care about Solomon only to the extent that we learn from what he did. That is the only reason we care about him. He lived a long time ago. So what we learn from him is that when you feel that you have extraordinary capabilities, when you feel that you are very strong in your belief in God, you have a very close relationship with God, then go back to the basics. Every action you contemplate, evaluate it to determine if it will convey the image of God to the affected. Then determine how it will convey the image of God to the affected. If you do this, you will reduce the chance of doing this that will make you turn away from God. Well, that brings us to the end of this Bible study on Solomon. It also brings us to the end of our Bible study series on the heart of David. In the next Bible study session, we'll go to a new series and we'll announce the series at that time. We thank all the people that will participate with us in these Bible studies. Sometime in the future, you have the opportunity to participate anytime you like by visiting the website at bankingblessing.com. There you can watch the video for this Bible study or any of our previous Bible studies. You can also download the audio file or listen to it on site. You can also download a PDF of the presentation. And at the website, each Bible study comes with an introduction, a text that tells you briefly what the Bible study is about. So you can participate at your own time from wherever you are, as long as you have access to the internet. We thank you for participating. And we pray that you learn something from our website, from this Bible study session and other ones. You will learn something that makes a positive impact on your life and draws you closer to God's purpose for your life. Thank you, and God bless you.